A Lakota chief's daughter lay mute from shock. A runaway bride healed her and found a family. The first thing I noticed about her was the mud on her boots. Not the dress white, what was left of it, hem torn off at the knee and the rest gone the color of the road. Not the veil she was still wearing, half-pinned, trailing down her back like something she'd forgotten to take off. The mud. Hard-caked red clay on those little boots, the kind of mud you get on the East Bench Road when the creek jumps its bank, and it hadn't rained in 11 days. So she'd been walking a while. I had my back to the barn door sorting tack when she came up the lane, didn't announce herself. Just walked up and stopped maybe 10 feet from me and stood there with her hands at her sides and said, "Can I have some water?" Not please, not sorry to bother you, just the bare sentence. I've always thought that took more nerve than the please. I said the pump was around the other side. She walked to it and I watched her work the handle. It sticks on the second stroke, always has, and she figured that out on her own and didn't ask for help and didn't look back at me. Drank from her hands, stood up and pressed her wet palms to her face and held them there a moment. I didn't go back to the tack. When she turned around I could see she'd been crying at some point, though not recently. The kind of face that's used up all its tears and come out the other side of something. She looked at me and then looked at the house, which is a 2-story frame house my wife and I built together 30 years back, painted white once, peeling now, and I know what it looks like to somebody who doesn't know the history of it. It looks like neglect. She asked if I had any work. I told her I had a ranch to run and one hired hand who was useless with cattle, and she said she could cook. I said, in that dress. She looked down at herself like she'd forgotten what she was wearing. Something came across her face that was almost a laugh, though it didn't get that far. She pulled the veil off her head and held it in one hand and let it hang there. She said her name was Cora, didn't offer a last name, I didn't ask for it. I said I had a daughter who didn't eat much and a man who ate too much, and that I cooked everything myself and didn't particularly want help with it. But if she needed a place to stand for a day or two, she could sleep in the spare room and earn her keep mending fence. She said, "Do you even know how to mend fence?" I said I'd been doing it since before she was born. She said, "Then teach me." I turned around and went back to the tack. I heard her boots on the porch steps. I heard the door. Here's what I won't do. I won't explain Willa, that's her name. It means woman in Lakota, which is not what I called her when she was born. She had another name, a white name her mother and I chose together, sitting at the kitchen table on a winter afternoon with a book of names between us and coffee going cold. But after her mother died, after what happened at the creek that fall, she stopped answering to it. Stopped answering to anything for a good long while. The doctor in Deadwood called it a nervous shock and said it might pass. Said the same thing the next 3 visits. I stopped going. She was 9 then. She was 12 when Cora walked up my lane. Willa was quiet the way a place gets quiet after something bad happened in it. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind. She ate what I put in front of her and she did her chores and she'd look at you when you talked but never talk back, not even to shake her head. If she needed something she'd come find me and take my hand and point. I'd learned that language. I was the only one who had. She slept badly. I knew because I slept badly too, and I'd hear her moving around the house at 2, 3 in the morning. I'd lie there and track the sounds down the hall into the kitchen, sometimes out onto the porch, and wait until I heard her go back to her room. I don't know what she was doing. I never asked. Some things you don't pray at. She had her mother's cheekbones and her mother's way of watching something from the side of her eye when she didn't want you to know she was watching. Willa's mother was Magpie Foot's daughter from the Standing Rock Band, and she'd had that same sideways attention, like she was reading the edge of a thing, not the face of it. I'd loved that about her. I'd loved more about her than I knew how to say. You spend enough years with somebody and they get into you in ways that aren't separate from who you are. Losing her hadn't just meant losing her. It had meant losing the version of myself that existed in her company. I never got over it. I want to be plain about that. Some men do. I didn't. There wasn't a morning in 3 years I didn't turn over in the dark expecting to find her there. But you don't get the luxury of not getting over things when there's a child in the house. You get up. You make the coffee. You go out to the cattle. You come back in and you make supper, and you sit across from your daughter, who has gone somewhere you can't reach her, and you do all of it because there's nothing else worth doing. That's all I can say about Wea that makes any sense. She was my daughter and she was silent, and I would have stood in front of a train for her, and it wasn't enough, and I lived with that every day. Cora slept in the spare room that first night, and I expected to find her gone in the morning. She wasn't. She was at the stove, which I had specifically not invited her to use, and she'd found the coffee and the salt pork and the hard biscuits from the day before, and she was heating all of it. I stood in the doorway. She didn't look up. She said, "I found 3 eggs. You want them?" I said I'd take them. She plated everything without asking where anything went. She just opened the right cabinet on the second try, like she was familiar with the logic of how someone else had stocked a kitchen. I found out later her mother had laid out a kitchen the same way, staples left, crockery right, good flour in the canister nearest the stove. She'd been in kitchens like this one before, and the body remembers. Wea came down while we were eating. She stopped in the doorway the same way I had, only she looked at Cora a full 4 or 5 seconds before she came to the table, pulled out her chair, sat down, looked at the plate Cora set in front of her. Cora didn't make a fuss over her. Didn't say anything to her at all, just set the plate down the same way she'd set mine, and went back to the stove, and that was that. She understood something instinctively, or she'd seen something like Wea before, or maybe she just had good sense about when noise was wrong. Whatever it was, she didn't fill the air around my daughter with cheerful chatter and soft questions the way visitors always had. The well-meaning women from town who came out twice a year and talked to Wea like she was a much younger child loudly, as if volume helped. After breakfast, I took Wea with me to the south fence and Cora stayed at the house. When we came back at noon, the porch had been swept and the window in the front room was open, and Cora was somewhere inside doing something quiet. I knocked on the inside of my own front door, which tells you something about how she changed the feeling of the house in about 4 hours. She called from the back, "Dinner's an hour." I stood there a moment, then I went to wash up. She stayed a week before I stopped thinking she'd leave. The fence work, I want to be honest, she was poor at it at first. She'd never used a hammer with any real force and she was tentative about it, the way you are when you're not sure of the thing you're hitting. I showed her grip. I showed her how you use your elbow and not your wrist, and how the hammer head does the work if you let it fall right. By the 4th day, she was driving posts clean enough that I didn't have to go back over hers. She asked good questions, not too many, not too few. She'd watch me do a thing twice before she'd try it, which is the right number of times. And she didn't try to talk through the silence when there wasn't anything worth saying. We'd work a stretch of fence in quiet for 20, 30 minutes and neither of us felt the need to fill it, and that told me something about her. She knew the land was rough because I'd let it go. Not badly, not the way some ranches go when a man gives up entirely, but it had the look of a place running on the minimum. I'd kept the cattle healthy and the fences mostly up in the roof sound, and the rest, the garden that used to run the whole south side of the house, the small orchard my wife had planted and tended, the second barn we'd started framing and never finished, all of that had just been frozen where it stood. A monument to the year I'd stopped doing more than what I had to. Cora saw it. She didn't say anything about it, but I'd catch her looking at the half-built barn frame sometimes, standing still with her hands on her hips, and I knew she was doing the same arithmetic I'd been avoiding. How much would it take? What it would look like if it were whole? One evening, near the end of that first week, I asked her straight out why she'd been on that road. She was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just thinking about how much she wanted to say and in what order. She told me she'd been 3 hours from marrying a man her father had arranged. A man who had money, had standing, had a house that was too large and too new and too clean in a way that felt like a warning. A man who had never once in 2 years of courtship said a word to her that made her feel anything but furniture, well-regarded furniture, kept in a good room, but furniture all the same. She'd stood in the vestibule of her father's church with flowers in her hands, and she'd looked at the door to the nave where the man was waiting, and she'd thought, I will do this, and 30 years from now I will still be doing this, and the thought had just opened under her like a hole in the floor. She'd gone out the side door, down the back alley, and walking. She said she didn't have a plan. She said that was the honest truth, and she wasn't proud of it. I asked what she thought her father would do when he found out. She looked out at the mountains for a moment. The far ones had snow on them already, a thin cap, and the light was going orange behind them. She said she didn't care anymore, and then she said she'd surprised herself by how much she meant it. I looked at her. The last of the light was on the side of her face, and she wasn't looking at me, just out at those mountains, and I thought, this is a woman who'd been waiting a long time to say that sentence and hadn't known she was waiting. It had taken walking 15 miles in wedding boots to find out. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything worth saying. I just poured the last of the coffee and handed her the cup, and she took it without looking away from the mountains, and that was a whole conversation that didn't need words. The change with Wia happened so gradual, I almost missed it starting. 6, 7 days in, I came up from the cattle pen in the late afternoon and didn't find them in their usual places. Cora was usually at the table or the stove that time of day. Wia was usually on the porch with whatever she'd been drawing on her slates, which was the one thing she'd kept up through all of it, drawing. The doctor had said to let her have whatever she kept hold of. Drawing was what she kept hold of. I found them out behind the house, where the old apple trees were. My wife had planted those trees the second year we had the place, 4 of them in a row, and I'd watered them every summer out of some feeling I couldn't quite name, not hope, exactly. Something quieter than that. The obligation you feel towards something another person cared about. Cora was sitting with her back against one trunk, and she had one of Wia's slates on her knee, and she was drawing something. And Wia was kneeling next to her watching with that intense sideways attention. I stopped where they couldn't see me. Cora wasn't talking. She was just drawing, and every so often she'd turn the slate so Wia could see it, and Wia would look at it very closely, leaning in, and then Cora would go back to drawing. She was drawing the trees. Just the trees as they were, the bent old trunks, the low branches that had grown sideways for years because the wind always came from the west, the way the bark had gone gray and grooved. The exact particular trees, not some general idea of trees. Wia reached out at one point and touched the slate where Cora had drawn the heaviest trunk, tracing the line with one finger without actually touching the drawn marks, just the air above them. Cora held the slate still and didn't say anything. I went back to the cattle pen and stayed there longer than I needed to. After supper that night, Wia came and stood in the doorway of the kitchen where I was cleaning up. She had a slate and she held it out to me. I dried my hands and took it. She'd drawn a woman. From behind, sitting against a tree trunk, from the exact angle she would have had watching from close by. The woman's posture was right, the loose way Cora sat when she wasn't working, one knee up, one arm resting along her leg, her head tilted slightly. Wia had captured the ease of it, the specific ease of someone who'd settled into themselves. She was 12 years old and she had it exactly. I looked at that drawing for a long time. Then I looked at Wia, who was watching me from the side of her eye, checking something on my face. I said, "You see things plain." She didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. She held my gaze the full 3 seconds, which was 2 more than usual. Then she took the slate back carefully, like it was something she intended to keep. That was the first time in almost a year I'd said something to her that she'd seemed to actually hear. A month passed, then most of another. The second barn didn't get finished that summer. That was a 3-man winter project and there wasn't time, but Cora got the garden going. Not the whole south side. That would have been too much this late in the season, but a strip along the fence that she turned by hand with a borrowed spade and put in the things that would still come up before the cold. Turnips, winter squash, some late beans. She did it in the early mornings before the household was up, and I'd come out to find her already at it, on her knees in the dark soil. And I'd stand on the porch with my coffee and watch her work and not say anything because there was nothing wrong with the picture. She traded the wedding dress for a pair of my old dungarees by then, cut down and rolled at the ankle, and one of my work shirts with the sleeves pushed up. She wore her hair in a braid she'd started doing in a Lakota way I didn't recognize at first, looser than the white style, with a kind of wrap and twist at the side. She'd asked Wea to show her. Wea had shown her. She'd done it right the first try and kept doing it that way after. That was the second thing, after the drawing in the orchard. The third thing was this. One morning I woke at 4 with the old black feeling, the particular weight that comes at 4 in the morning when there's nothing to get up for yet but you can't stay down either, and I lay there a while listening to the house, and when I finally got up and moved through the hall I found Cora's door open and her room empty. I went to the kitchen expecting to find her there alone. She was there, but so was Wea. Wea at 4 in the morning, which was when she wandered. Cora at 4 in the morning, which meant she'd been awake at 4 before, must have learned the pattern, must have decided to be present in it rather than absent. They were sitting across from each other at the table. Cora had her elbows on the wood and a cup in her hands that had long gone cold. Wea had her slate and was drawing. Neither of them was talking and neither of them seemed to need to. The lamp was low and the window over the sink was dark, and there was just the two of them in that yellow light, each in her own quiet, sharing it. I stood in the hall doorway long enough to know they were all right, and then I went back to bed because I wasn't needed. That's a strange feeling for a man who'd gotten used to being the only one. Not a bad feeling, just strange. The kind of strange that takes a moment to recognize as good. I want to say something about Cora that I might not say right, so I'll say it plain and let it stand as it is. She was a handsome woman. She had a long straight back and a way of standing that wasn't soft but wasn't hard either, just upright, like someone who decided early not to apologize for taking up space. She had brown eyes that were darker than they looked in certain light and lighter than they looked in other light, and she had a good jaw. I noticed all of that the way you notice whether it registers. You don't have to think about it. But that's not what I mean when I say she changed things. What she changed was the sound of the house. A house with no one in it but a man who's grieving and a child who's gone silent has a particular sound. And it's not silence exactly. It's more like the sound that's left after something loud has stopped. You get used to it the way you get used to a ringing in your ears after a shot goes off too close. You stop hearing it, and then something shifts and you can hear it again, and you realize how long you've been in it. Cora changed that, not by being loud. She wasn't loud, but she had a way of existing in a space that made it feel occupied in the right way, the particular sound of someone else's coffee cup going down on a wood table, the sound of a door being handled with familiarity rather than tentativeness. Small sounds that mean a place is lived in. I'm not going to dress it up into something prettier than what it was. It was just that I'd been alone a long time and someone good had come to stay, and she was real and present in a way that cut through the distance I'd put between myself and everything that wasn't strictly necessary. My wife's name was Margaret. I'll say it now. She'd been gone 3 years and I still couldn't say her name without something moving in my chest that I didn't want disturbed, and I'd gotten good at not saying it. But I thought it sometimes, standing at the window of the kitchen in the early morning with the coffee in my hand, when the light was right. The way Margaret had loved the light in that kitchen in the fall, how she'd always stop what she was doing and just stand in it for a moment. I'd find myself stopping too sometimes, standing in the place she'd stood. I wasn't thinking about Cora the way I'd thought about Margaret. I want to be clear about that. It wouldn't have been honest and it wouldn't have been fair. What I felt about Cora was something different, a recognition maybe. The recognition of a person who was doing what had to be done and not making a performance of it. I respected that. After a while, I respected it the way you respect ground that holds under your boots, quietly. Because it would be strange to make a fuss about it, but you'd notice fast if it wasn't there. She'd been with us about 6 weeks when she told me about the letter. We were on the south fence again, the tail end of it, a section that needed new posts and had needed them since spring. The sky was that high clear blue you get in September before the first cold comes, the kind of blue that makes distances look closer than they are. The mountains had a little new snow at the very tops. She was driving a post, working the maul with her full weight behind it now, not tentative anymore, and she said without looking up from the work, "My father has found out where I am." I asked how. She said somebody in town had written a letter. She didn't know who. Could have been anybody. She'd been in Ridgeline for 2 months. It was not a big town. People had eyes. I set my end of the wire down. She kept working the post. She said he would come, probably in the next few weeks, possibly with the man she'd been meant to marry. I looked out at the land for a moment. The cattle were spread across the far pasture, small dark shapes in the yellow grass. I'd worked this place for 30 years. I'd put my name on this ground. I knew every fence line on it and the history of every repair. I said, "What do you want to do?" She stopped and stood up straight and looked at me, not from the side, straight. She said, "I want to stay." I said, "You know what that means. When they come, they'll try to take you." She said she knew. I said, "You'll need to be clear about your own mind. I can stand between them and this house, but I can't decide for you." She said she was clear. She said she'd been clear since the day she didn't walk through that church door. She said she was clearer about this than she'd been about anything she could remember, and that she'd spent enough of her life being unclear in places that mattered to know the difference. I looked at her. She was looking back at me with that settled look, the look I'd been trying to put a name to for weeks. It was the look of someone who'd stopped waiting to be told who she was. I said, "Then you stay." She nodded once, then she went back to the post. I went back to the wire. We finished that section by dark and walked back to the house without talking, and neither of us needed to. That night I sat at the kitchen table after Wea was asleep, and I thought about what was coming. I wasn't afraid of it. I'd been the last man standing between people I loved and the things that could take them more than once in my life. It was something I knew how to do. What I hadn't known how to do for the past 3 years was have a reason to. Her father came on a Thursday. I'd half expected the other man too. He came alone. He was a big man in the way that matters, not physical size, but the size of a man who's been deferred to so long he doesn't remember it happened any other way. He came down the lane in a good black buggy with a hired driver, and he tied up at the post and walked toward the house with the settled walk of a man who expected to get what he came for. I was on the porch. He looked at me, he looked at the ranch. He looked at me again, the honest look, the one where he took stock of what I was and made a calculation. He said, "I'm looking for my daughter." I said, "I know who you are." He said, "Is she here?" I said she was. He said, "I'll speak to her, now." I didn't move from the post I was leaning on. I said, "You can speak to her when she decides to come out. You'll say what you came to say and then you'll leave, and whatever she tells you will be her decision and none of my business." He looked at me a long time. Men like him have a way of sizing up other men, money, standing, bloodline, what kind of trouble you'd be worth, and I didn't have much of what he was looking for. I was a widower with a half-finished ranch and a hired hand who didn't do much. In his accounting, I was somewhere between inconvenient and dismissible. He said, "She's my daughter. You have no standing here." I said, I'm not claiming any. He said, then step aside. I said, I'm not in your way. Go knock on the door. He went to the door and knocked, and Cora opened it. I stayed on the porch. I kept my eyes on the lane and the mountains and the hired driver who sat with the reins loose in his hands and looked at everything except the house. The conversation happened at the door, and then inside for a while, and then at the door again. I could hear her father's voice go loud once and come back down. I could hear Cora's voice stay even the whole way through. At one point I heard her father say, "A daughter's obligations," and then I couldn't make out the rest of it, just the tone of a man trying to use a word like a weight. And I heard Cora's voice come back, steady as that fence we'd finished together, without give. He came out onto the porch when it was done. He stood next to me for a moment. Whatever he was going to say, he seemed to decide against it. Instead, he looked at me with the look of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. He said, "You'll take care of her." I said, "That's not a question I'll answer to you." He looked at me. Something passed over his face that wasn't defeat and wasn't acceptance, more like the specific resignation of a man who's realized he's been outworked at something he thought was his by right. He got in the buggy. The driver turned them around. They went down the lane. I didn't watch them all the way out. I turned and Cora was in the doorway behind me, arms crossed, and she let out a long, slow breath through her nose like she'd been holding it since before she walked up my lane 2 months before. She said, "Thank you for not saying anything." I said I hadn't done anything. She said, "I know, that's what I mean." I understood what she meant. The only thing she'd needed was for somebody to stand between her and the pressure long enough for her to say her own piece in her own time. She hadn't needed me to fight for her or speak for her. She just needed the ground to hold. I nodded. She went back inside. I stood on the porch another minute and looked out at the lane where the buggy dust was still settling, and I felt not satisfaction exactly, something quieter than that. The feeling of having done a specific thing right. I'm going to tell you about the night in October, because that's when things became what they are. First frost came on the 6th, early that year, and I'd been out past dark making sure the cattle were in and the troughs wouldn't freeze hard, and the gate on the south pen was latched right. I came in cold all the way to the bone, the kind of cold that doesn't leave just because you've come indoors. Cora had supper on. Wea was at the table already with a book she'd taken to reading in the evenings, a thing she'd started the week before, picking the book up off the shelf herself, sitting down with it, turning the pages. She didn't read aloud, but she read. I washed up and sat down and we ate, the three of us, in the quiet we'd gotten comfortable with over the months. The fire was good. The frost was pressing at the windows. It was a particular kind of evening that the plains do well, when the cold outside makes the warmth inside feel like something you've built and earned rather than just stumbled into. After Wea went upstairs, Cora poured 2 cups of coffee and pushed one across the table to me and sat back down. We sat with the lamps burning and the fire settling and didn't say anything for a while, which was fine. Then she said, "I have to tell you something." I said, "All right." She said the man she'd been supposed to marry had written her a letter through her father. He wished her well. He said he hoped she was settled somewhere and that he held no ill will. She said it quietly, looking at the table, and when she was done she was quiet some more. I said, "How'd that land?" She thought about it. She said she'd expected it to move her somehow, relief or regret or something, and it hadn't. She said she'd read it twice to make sure and still nothing. Just a letter from a man she didn't know very well, telling her a thing she already believed to be true about him, that he was decent in a particular narrow way. She said, "I think that's what was always wrong. He was decent, and I felt nothing." I said, "That sounds like resolution." She said, "That's what it is." We were quiet again. Then she said my name, Elias, and she used it the way people do when what comes next is something they want to land clearly. She said, I know what I am here. I know what I've become in this house. I'm not asking anything from you, but I want you to know that I see you, how hard you work, what you carry, the way you are with her. She stopped. Then she put her hand on the table between us, open, palm up, not reaching toward me, just placed there. She said, you took me in when you had no reason to. You stood between me and my father and didn't say a word, just stood there. You've been good to me and to her, and I think you've been doing it because it's who you are, and I think you don't know how rare that is. And I wanted to say it out loud while I had the nerve to. I looked at her hand on the table. I looked at my own hands, which are old hands worked in. Then I put mine over hers. She turned hers over and held on. I don't know how long we sat like that. Long enough that the fire burned down and neither of us moved to feed it. Long enough that the coffee went cold. Outside, the frost was tightening its hold on everything, and inside there was just the lamplight and the sound of the house being still around us. There was no speech in me. There never has been. What I had was the feeling, and it was physical, like something shifting in my chest, a weight that had been there so long I'd stopped knowing it was there, that something I'd been holding up alone for 3 years had been found. Not fixed, not made the way it was before, but seen. Margaret had known what I was. She'd known without me having to arrange myself or explain myself. She just looked at me and known, and I'd lived inside that knowledge for 20 years without understanding how much I'd been leaning on it. Losing her had meant losing that too. The person who saw you plain. I'd stopped believing I'd have it again. I'd stopped thinking it was something I was owed or would find. I was 54 years old. I had a ranch that was half built and a daughter who was coming back from somewhere terrible, slow and certain as the melt in spring. And I had this woman's hand in mine in the kitchen of the house I'd built with my wife, and the frost at the windows, and the lamps going low. I said I'd like you to stay, not the way I'd said it the first time when she'd walked up the lane. This time the words meant something different and we both knew it. She said, I know. She said, I'm going to. She didn't let go of my hand, and I didn't let go of hers, and we sat there until the fire had burned to coals. Finally she went upstairs and I got up and banked the fire and stood in the kitchen in the dark for a few minutes, not thinking anything particular, just standing in the quiet of the house with everyone in it where they should be. I've thought about that minute a lot since. What it was. I think it was the first time in 3 years I was somewhere and felt the ground hold under me, not forever, not fixed and certain, just solid enough to stand on and mean to go on standing. We spoke on a Sunday in November. Cora and I hadn't said anything formal about ourselves. We were what we were, and the whole county could see it plain enough, and nobody said a word to my face, and I didn't start the conversation. We knew, or knew something, in the way children know things, not from being told but from the quality of the air in a house, the way two people move around each other, what they don't have to say. We had been doing better in ways that were hard to name, still quiet, still the watcher, the sideways looker, the girl who'd come down at 4 in the morning and sit at the kitchen table. But there was a looseness in how she moved through the house now, something that wasn't there before, the particular ease of a person who stopped waiting for the bad thing. She laughed once, a quick sound surprised out of her, at something the dog did with the porch cat. It was over before I could turn around, but it happened. That Sunday I was by the barn when I heard Cora's voice from the direction of the garden, and then a pause, and then another voice, thin, a little rough, like something that hadn't been used in a long time. I set down what I was doing. Wia's voice said something I couldn't make out. Cora's answered, Wia's again. I walked to the corner of the barn and stopped. They were in the garden strip, turning the last of the squash before the next hard freeze. Wia was facing away from me so I couldn't see her face. Cora's face I could see, and she was listening with her hands in her coat pockets and her chin tilted up a little the way she did when she was attending to something. not performing attention, just giving it. I put my back against the barn wall. It wasn't a flood. It wasn't some great release of everything that had been held back. It was just a girl talking to a woman in a cold garden, the way people do, a sentence here and a response there, both of them still turning squash while they talked. The ordinary back and forth of two people who have gotten comfortable enough with each other to fill the air between them. I stood there until I heard them come back toward the house, and then I went the long way around so they wouldn't find me. I didn't want to be watched just then. Some moments you want to carry yourself for a little while before you share them. I went down to the south fence and I stood at the far post, the last one Cora and I had driven together, and I put my hand on it and I stood there. I'm not going to try to say what I felt. A man at 54 who's buried his wife and watched his daughter go somewhere nobody could follow her and learned to do the minimum, and then seen all of it start to come back. There isn't a word for what that is. There's just the cold air on your face and the solid wood under your hand and the sound of your daughter's voice coming out of a garden 50 yards away. I stood there until I was sure I had hold of myself. Then I went back to the house. That evening after supper, I was at the stove and Wea came and stood at the kitchen table. She was holding one of her slates, and she set it down on the table and looked at me. On the slate, she'd drawn 3 figures standing in front of a house. The house was the house. She got the porch right, the 2 upstairs windows, the way the left side eave came down a little lower than the right from where I'd had to re-roof it 2 summers back. 3 figures, a tall one, a medium one, a small one. Rough. She'd never been as careful about people as she was about trees and land, but they were plain enough. I looked at the drawing, I looked at her. She said, and her voice still had that quality of disuse, a little hoarse, she said, "Are we a family now?" It wasn't quite a question. She asked it the way you ask something when you mostly know the answer but want to hear it said. I said yes. She looked at the slate again. Then she picked it up and took it with her when she went upstairs, the same way she'd taken the drawing of Cora in the orchard, like it was something she intended to keep. I stood at that stove a while after she was gone. Cora was in the front room. I could hear her moving. The fire was going. The frost was back at the windows, harder now, the kind that comes to stay. I went to the doorway of the front room. Cora looked up from what she was doing. I said, she asked if we're a family. Cora said, "What did you tell her?" I said I told her yes. She looked at me a moment. Something in her face went still and then right again, the way a thing settles when it's found its place. She said, "Good. I'm not going to give you a neat ending, because life doesn't do that." The second barn got framed that winter, me and 2 men from town and Cora hauling boards in the cold with her breath making clouds in front of her and not a complaint. We got the roof on before the heavy snow came. In the spring I started the orchard's south row, the one that had been missing since a bad storm took 2 trees the winter before Margaret died, 4 new saplings. They won't bear for years. I planted them anyway. Wea spoke more as the months turned. Not a flood, a slow accumulation, the way land warms up after a hard winter, degree by degree until one day you notice the ground is soft underfoot. By spring she was talking to me the way she talked to Cora, plain, without decoration, saying what she meant and not much more. She started going into Ridgeline on Saturdays, which she hadn't done in 3 years, and she came back with things she'd noticed, the new horse at the livery, a bird she'd seen on the road she didn't know the name of, something a woman at the dry goods store had said to her. Small things. The small things that mean you've rejoined the world. Cora and I married in March. A minister from the next county, no fuss, just the 3 of us in the front room with the fire going and snow on the ground outside. Wea stood beside Cora during the short words and held her hand, and nobody made anything of it. There's a photograph from that day. 3 of us outside the house, snow behind us, the mountains in the distance. I'm in the middle. Wea is on my left with her hand in mine. Cora is on my right, her shoulder to my arm, her face turned toward the camera with that settled look she had, the one that said she was exactly where she'd chosen to be. I look at that photograph sometimes. I look at the version of myself in it, weathered, old ranch coat, not much to look at in the way of the world, and I think about the morning she'd walked up the lane with mud on her boots and just the bare sentence, "Can I have some water?" I think about Weah in the garden, finally, the squash turning in her hands, her voice coming out of her like something that had been waiting a long time for the right morning. I think about Cora's hand open on the table between us. There was a word my wife's mother taught me once, Margaret's mother. We were standing on the bank of the Grand River in the cold, the two of us, and she said it and then she told me what it meant, more or less something like, the moment a broken thing finds the shape it was supposed to be, not the old shape, not as it was before, a different thing now with the break in it but whole in its own way. I didn't have the word for what was happening in that kitchen in October when Cora put her hand on the table and I put mine over it, but I had the feeling. I have it still. Every morning when I come down and the house is alive around me. Every evening when we're all three at the table and the fire's going and there's nothing wrong with the picture. A man can go a long time telling himself the minimum is enough. Then something changes and he realizes he was wrong, and the question is whether he's too far gone to know what to do with that. I wasn't too far gone. I don't know why. Maybe it was just the mud on her boots and the nerve it took to ask for water plain without the please. Maybe that's all it takes. One person walking up your lane who sees you for what you are and decides to stay.